responding.
Okay, yeah, I just started.
Thank you. Yeah, so Peter, Joe, if, okay, so all the questions addressed there, do you want to provide any summary of the answers to the questions, or you feel like your written responses are adequate enough?
I think Joe tackled them. We're happy to answer any other questions if anyone floats in. But yeah, I guess the two questions that were there, Joe answered the one during the presentation about whether it was more or less difficult to reproduce studies that did share their code and data. It was, as Joe said, a bit easier to do the ones that did share their data and code, but even those still had some challenges, to be honest. Just because there were often discrepancies between the paper and what was done in those code. And even when we had the data in the code, sometimes decisions were made that were not really clear, that required some digging into in terms of how they did some pre-processing, things like that. So there were challenges even when those things were available. Although there was maybe one study that was actually pretty implementable right out of the box. And then the other question that Naomi had was about engaging students. Joe, I think you answered that one. Do you want to jump in there? I mean, I can make comments too.
Yeah, and I was also just thinking one thing we both learned this past semester was that these things take quite a bit of time and effort. And to really do a full reproduction, and of course, you should devote several weeks to it. So that reproduction, I mean, it's a valuable piece of work because you're essentially teaching students how to conduct the entire research process from beginning to end using an exemplar model that is the paper you've chosen to reproduce. But it does take a significant amount of time, and each step is a challenge, and you've got to leave room for it.
Yeah, but I will say, Joe, you know, like if you think about it, the first time we did this versus the second time, like the stuff we've built, which anyone can adopt, has made it actually much less challenging in some ways, because some of the structures are there, some of the key steps in terms of how we did it exist there now. So you don't have to make it up whole cloth from the get-go. I will say too, you know, the second time around, it still took several weeks to run these. Like in my stats class, it took us 3-4 weeks. And we did 4 of these kind of in parallel subgroups. And it took us about a month and change to do them, plus some time in the summer to clean it up. But I will say the level of that study was much higher than the levels ones we tried before. So we did a more complex task in an equal amount of time. And the students, at least the feedback that I got from them, was they all thought it was one of the most rewarding experiences they had done as grad students because it was so challenging and really drew them into the research process in a way that, you know, that you don't necessarily get from just doing a cookie cutter lab, right? You had to engage at a much higher level. So I think we found that rewarding. And you know, to kind of get to the heart of Naomi's question, I think once the students start to sort of really tangibly see the benefit of doing these kind of things and being involved in it, especially at the graduate level, I can speak to that more so the undergraduate, but they want to be there to do that kind of research. So they really engage in these things, and it sort of becomes its own snowball building up speed downhill. And I think to Shaowen's earlier point too, that will carry over to the larger geospatial community, hopefully, once we make these things a bit lower barriers to entry with some of the infrastructure that has been built by many different groups at this point. So a little of a long answer to the question, but I think it all sort of fits together in this larger picture. I don't know if there are other questions open at the moment.
Yeah, Scott just asked a good question. Can you venture a guess to how the methods used in these studies are generalizable to non-COVID type data? The very top level answer to that is, if you mean the methods of doing a reproduction, I think at every step of the way, we've been mindful of trying to create a template and infrastructure that can be translatable to multiple types of geographic research, not just COVID research. In terms of the particular methods, I mean, one of the great things about these reproducible notebooks is, of course, you can copy and paste chunks of code from all over the place to create a new study, right? And the techniques that we've been talking about are widely applicable to other contexts, right? Like generalized estimating equations, cluster detection. What else have we used? Like spatial regression. What else is in there, Peter?
Yeah, I think to the 2 points on that are, yes, so they can easily implement those spatial regression techniques, for instance, using the notebooks. But in doing the reanalyses, we actually corrected some of the misuses of those analyses the first time around. So one of the questions that kind of, I mean, the studies were still credible, but they oftentimes would not do the appropriate effect estimates for some of these regression techniques. So our notebooks do use those appropriately. So even at that one particular level, we're propagating sort of best research practices across the discipline. At the meta level that Joe's saying, we were very, very mindful of making all of this infrastructure generalizable as possible across all the different fields of geography. So for instance, these were mainly observational based research designs, right? Using COVID data you can pull from different places. But in building that template and building that template repository, we have folders in there that we did not use for these projects, but we know would be needed for like field-based research, for instance. So, your data collection plan, there's a template for that. There's a separate folder for organizing all of the kind of field work you would do. And of course, it would need to be adapted for each different research project, but at least there's a backbone there to be worked on across the geographical sciences. So I think that's sort of an important contribution that we made as well, and are continuing to make as we revise that notebook kind of going forward. Yeah.
And I guess to add on to that, hopefully as the methods are, if anyone does look to our notebooks to get insight into how to implement any of these methodologies using R or Python, hopefully they don't just see the chunk of code that implements that particular technique, but also the series of code ahead of it that preprocesses the data and checks the assumptions for that model. And they're also learning from those and translating those to other studies.
Yeah, and perhaps at the broadest level, just, the approach that we laid out here and institute into those notebooks and are writing up parallel white papers and papers about that could be published. That approach very much applies to sort of like any type of research, right? It can be used in a physical geography class just as much as a human geography class, or even like a psychology class, right? It's the same sort of like deconstruction and reconstruction kind of approach that's just at the heart of this sort of evaluation mechanism in science. So yeah, I think it's quite generalizable, and we're going to kind of keep working to make it as generalizable as possible, I suppose.
Yeah, that was a great question and also nice answer. I think from the computational aspects and the infrastructure perspectives, there's always this sort of a generalizability balance against sort of the friendly and the direct user support tailored to specific communities. The COVID-19 experience we had related to specific terminologies and some methodologies very much suitable for COVID problems, may not be easily transferable to other communities, let's say, physical geography or let's say hydrology. So to respond to this kind of nuances and differences in the CyberGSX platform, we had this community space created to be tailoring sort of the sort of templates, as Peter and Joe mentioned, specifically to different community needs. So I think that needs to continue to be researched and sort of advanced so that there's this balance, right? There's a difficulty to be sort of completely generalizable in a sense, for coming up with methods and infrastructure, and there's a trade-off, right? So, but having a broad community to experiment with this balance is clearly a promising area to do further research.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would say is that in trying the replications, basically moving analysis from one location to another, what we've run into along the way are a lot of really fundamental questions that I don't know that we have really good answers to. But if we do answer them, they make very generalizable contributions. So for instance, like if you just take a statistical analysis for one location and put it in another location, it's not clear necessarily what the best way is to compare the results of those two things. So did the result replicate? Is it a question of direction, magnitude, effect, and like how many locations do you need to know whether it's replicating generalizably across space, right? So there's some like basic questions baked into what we're doing that are sort of interesting questions in terms of like having this like root level speaking to how we generalize in geographical sciences more broadly. Just as like a quick example, we were replicating this study that was done in New York City, and we basically did what I called a naive replication, where we took the exact same model and plopped it in a new location in Phoenix, right? And we got like okay results, but obviously there's contextual differences in Phoenix. So then we started to monkey with that and add in what we know about Phoenix into the model to make it place specific. And then we tried to extend that by adding in a bunch of different temporal effects and things like this, so spatial temporal dynamics. And that's been really interesting and instructive in the sense that like we've learned a number of lessons along the way in doing that, that aren't just specific to that model, but are specific to the process of like trying to move a methodology or an approach from one place to another that will be generalizable, I think, across any type of research. I think is quite interesting. I saw Jay just asked a question, which is, to what extent is your assessment of credibility based on differences on results between the published study and your reproduction? Joe, you want to tackle that? Because I've been talking for too long again.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, we have statistical tests for comparing means and comparing differences, right? But we don't necessarily have statistical tests built up to determine how different an effect from one study is from the effect of another study. So I mean, what we have been doing so far is that I can speak to, which is looking at the direction of all the relationships, ideally also the magnitude of the relationships and the significance of the relationships, and hoping that all of those are consistent with one another. And when we find any issues with the methodology or the conceptualization of the paper, we're trying to move towards doing a reanalysis of that, adjusting the parameters and trying to see if those mattered, essentially kind of an uncertainty analysis for your conclusions, to determine if the results change the direction, magnitude, or significance of the theorized relationships.
And we really started with the deep dive approach, as Joe is saying, trying to understand how the things are working in different places as a way to make the assessment rather than just a quantitative comparison. But we are also starting to pursue or set up some more formal quantitative analyses. So with that example before of taking the same model from New York and putting it in Phoenix, we've also been discussing on my end, sort of in one statistical framework, having a multi-level model where you've got several different, the same model running in multiple different locations for COVID data or whatever. But then you have a multi-level modeling framework that allows you to sort of get localized estimates of effects to make direct comparisons within the same regression framework. And that way you can compare the coefficients because they're all kind of built in the same statistical framework, as opposed to sort of like running it over here, running it over there, and then kind of looking at the numbers, which isn't the best way to do comparisons. You can actually formally do it, but we haven't gone too far down that road yet. We instead we're focusing on the infrastructure build and the deep dive build, because that helps the students sort of learn the techniques and learn the approach better. But kind of as we get to these kind of larger questions, generalizability, these meta level questions, we are starting to move towards doing these more formal statistical testing procedures, which basically takes us down the road towards a meta-analysis. Essentially, if you have enough of these analyses, you can sort of like wrangle them all together with different weighting schemes and things like this. So, but that's just a long-winded answer to a short question. So, Shaowen, did you want to jump in there? I could see you leaning forward.
No, I think that was a nice answer. Thanks, Peter and Joe again. We might now want to stop the recording. I think the list of folks still in the session is relatively small. If we could help promote these folks to be panelists and attendees.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds fine. Let me stop recording.